Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the lost gold ingots of Cancino Arroyo in New Mexico. So this story starts out on August 9th of 1880 in Cimarron, New Mexico. A local outlaw named Porter Stockton and his friend by the last name of West got into an altercation that erupted into a shootout. And Porter Stockton was no stranger to robbery or murder, and him and his friend West had now killed two men in a couple of minutes. So they knew this wouldn't look good and they should mount their horses and hightail it out of town before the sheriff and a posse was alerted and sent to track them down. So they headed west out of town towards their hideout in Gallegos Canyon near Tres Piedras. And Tres Piedras is about 60 miles west through the rough New Mexico desert and canyon country. So just past midday, the outlaws got to the Rio Grande River and crossed it. It was here that they noticed that some heavy storm clouds were coming towards them from the northwest. And since they were heading west, they would likely encounter them soon. So after they crossed the Rio Grande River, they continued west, and a rain started to fall on them. And by evening, it was turning into a pretty heavy rainfall. They couldn't see very well in front of them, much more than a few feet, and the usual trail that they had traveled many times was washing out, so they could really no longer tell where they were going. So now that they had lost the trail and they were unexpectedly lost, they took a trail leading downhill and it dumped them into Cancino Arroyo. And they went ahead and they decided to just stay in the arroyo as they continued on and attempted to see if they could get their bearings. So as anyone in the desert knows, you do not want to be in the desert arroyos when a storm is coming or it's raining, as flash floods can come fast and swift. But at this point, it seems that the arroyo had a small, gentle stream flowing through it. So, unbeknownst to Stockton and West, another group of three men were on the same trail, maybe about a half hour or less behind them. But they were not a posse of lawmen, as Stockton and West would assume would be trying to follow them. This was a group of three men on horseback who were also now lost in the storm and trying to get their bearings too. These three men had two heavily laden pack mules that were tied to their small train. So these mules were loaded down with gold ingots in their leather packs, and they had dozens of gold ingots in them. So these men had been lucky enough to come across an old Spanish parchment map that had led them to an old Spanish mine in Arizona. And there they found many stacked gold ingots in this old abandoned hidden mine. So they loaded up what they could carry on their mules, and apparently they loaded up what they could carry in this one trip, but there was said to still be a lot of gold ingots that remained in this mine. So they took what they could carry, and they were planning to make another trip once they were able to get back to Colorado, where they were from. And they were less than 100 miles or so from home when they got caught in this storm with their gold. Apparently, they may have written about or let their family members know about their find, as they plan to go back and we're going to need some more manpower to retrieve more gold. So these three men, not being from this particular area and not knowing the terrain in northern New Mexico all that well, especially in this area, they had become lost and disoriented in the storm. So since they hadn't really been here before, they didn't know any of the trails, and the trails were washing away, and they weren't sure what to do. And then they stumbled across the fresher looking tracks of the outlaws of Stockton and West. So they figured the best way to become unlost was to follow those tracks and hope to be led back to a normal trail. So as they followed the tracks, they ended up in the same arroyo that the outlaws were in. And up ahead, Stockton and West were starting to realize their mistake of their chosen direction. So they were not going to be able to find their way up and out of the arroyo, as the walls were getting taller and taller and were now some 50 feet tall or taller. So also the stream in the arroyo was getting about a foot deep or so at this point, and they determined they needed to turn around and retrace their steps to get a better spot to get out of the arroyo. So I guess at this point they figured it probably was too dangerous to be in this arroyo at this time. So the storm was heavy with lightning and was allowing them to see better in the darkening dusk and rain clouds. So as Stockton and West rounded one of the bends in the arroyo, they came face to face with the three men and their pack mules. And of course their pack mules were roped to the horses. So Stockton and West immediately assumed it was a posse from town tracking them down to kill them or take them to jail. So they responded very quickly on instinct and pulled out their pistols and fired at lightning speed, catching the men by surprise as they fell into the arroyo dead. Stockton and West shot the horses and the mules too. I'm not exactly sure why, but they also shot the horses and mules, and they left that carnage in the rising waters of the arroyo as they made their escape out of the arroyo. So once they reached the mouth of Cancino Arroyo, they were able to find their way back into Gallegos Canyon, and they were unaware that they had left a fortune in gold ingots behind them. So about an hour after the shootout, Cancino Arroyo was full of floodwaters that were now a few feet deep, and these waters washed over the dead men and their animals, and no doubt taking a lot of them downstream. So the next morning, up on the higher ground near Cancino Arroyo, an older Mexican sheep herder and his young son awoke for the day to their sheep herding duties. So they had been a small little lean-to for the night that was very nearby the canyon or the arroyo, and they had slept there, but they had slept very little due to the raging storm. So the older sheep herder had thought that he had heard gunshots the previous night, and they sounded pretty close, so he went around to investigate. And he discovered that all the sheep were accounted for, and so he walked over to the edge of Cancino Arroyo to gaze down at the dissipating floodwaters of the night before, and as he peered into the arroyo, he saw what he thought were the bodies of men. So the sheep herders, they climbed down into Cancino Arroyo to investigate. So here he found the bodies of 3 men, 3 horses, and a couple of pack mules with their leather packs. So they were all dead. And the sheep herder went ahead and cut open one of the packs and pulled out some long metal bars. So as he examined one of them, and it was thick with a layer of silt and mud on it, he noticed it was dark and heavy. So he thought it was iron, and he discarded the bars. But he kept one for a souvenir, or possibly to have something he would have from the scene as he recounted the story in the future. So the sheepherder, once they got back up on the rim, he tossed the ingot into their crude lean-to with their meager belongings, and then they tended to the sheep. So by midday that day, the rains came again. And with the ground already fairly saturated, the flood waters built up very quickly this time in the arroyo. This time they got to approximately 10 feet deep. These raging waters now swept everything downstream, some untold distances. So the next day, the ranch owner named Dolores Cancino, the person who Cancino Arroyo was named for, he came to bring food and check on the Mexican sheep herders. And it was then that the older gentleman recounted the story of what he had found in the arroyo the day before. Then the older sheep herder, he handed the ranch owner the iron ingot that he had found, and, had mentioned that the men were carrying so many of these. So the ranch owner, he took a look at it, and he took his thumbnail and he scratched away a lot of the mud and debris from it, and he looked at it and thought that it may actually be gold. He was actually pretty sure it was gold. He was so sure that the ranch owner and his sheep herders, they climbed down into the arroyo to look for the men and the horses and the mules in the foot or two of remaining water in the arroyo. So they had no luck locating anything at that point. And they figured that in another day or so, these floodwaters would most likely completely disappear into the desert, and they would be able to look over the basin of the arroyo, or the stream bed of the arroyo. So the ranch owner, Dolores Cancino, he decided that he was going to stay the night in the shoddy little lean-to with the sheep herders so that they could look again the next day. So the next day, the ranch owner, he got up in the morning, and he looked down into the arroyo, and he traveled along the edge of the arroyo for some ways while on his horse, and he was trying to locate the dead men and the horses again. And he had followed the arroyo downstream for some ways before he finally found the horses and a mule in the stream bed. So the bodies of the men were no longer, at this point, or no longer anywhere in sight, and it was obvious that the raging floodwaters had probably moved the bodies significantly further downstream, and the horses and the mules were most likely moved quite a bit downstream versus where they were originally. So it seemed that the lighter bodies of the men were probably carried down even further down the stream. So the ranch owner at this point, he had no luck determining the origin of the men and the animals, or where the shootout had originally occurred. So he left for town to have the gold ingot assayed. And while in town, he was told that the ingot looked to be fashioned in a way that the Spanish made their ingots in the old Spanish mining days of the Southwest. So Cancino was paid $2,000 for this gold ingot, and the rancher knew he just had to find the many other ingots, and he would be rich. And for the next several months, he looked up and down this Cancino Arroyo, especially after each flood, and he looked for evidence of where these ingots may have washed downstream, but he never found anything. Then in September of 1881, a little over a year later, he met a very experienced miner named Stephen Upholt. And they became friends, and eventually Cancino reluctantly told Upholt about his find and the details of his search. And Upholt surprisingly told the rancher that the gold is likely still in the same spot that it was discarded. Just more likely it was significantly deeper than before, maybe a few feet deeper. Uphold explained that when these arroyo sands become wet, they can no longer hold the weight above them and can turn into like a quicksand, letting very heavy objects sink significantly deeper with each rain or flood. So they eventually decided to form a partnership and look for these remaining gold ingots since Upholt was such a knowledgeable miner. So it took a couple months to get supplies and plans together, but soon they were back in the canyon when the fall temperatures were cooler and the monsoon season was pretty much done. So, well over a year had passed since the original discovery, and a few flash floods had come through since then. And as the sheep herder tried to help the men pinpoint the original discovery location, he noticed that the walls of the canyon and the path of the stream had already changed significantly. And as happens with desert arroyos, the walls are not usually fixed rock, and many times they are a mix of sand, silt, and clay kind of plastered together. And when these desert streams come to life after decent rains, they carve a continually new channel into the canyon floor. And these channels are ever changing and can be different from year to year. And eventually these unstable walls collapse into the arroyo, allowing for the carving to continue. So one day while in the arroyo, Upholt discovered a bit of a human skeleton sticking out of the sand, and he believed it was one of the men, and he believed that they then needed to head upstream to see what they could find. So they found the other two skeletons in the next few days, and they reasoned that they would find the horses and mules that were heavier upstream a little bit further. So after another week of searching upstream, they did find the skeleton of one of the mules. And they realized they were getting pretty close now to where the sheep herders' camp and lean-to was just over the rim. So Upholt eventually reached an area that he believed had a good probability of being in close vicinity of the lost treasure. So in this area, he dug 3 wide holes about 6 feet deep, and he probed below, and he determined that bedrock was at about 9 feet deeper. So the sands were very fine and loose here, so he figured that the bars had sunk a good distance. So a few days later, after widening and deepening the holes, Upholt ran across his first gold bar. It was about 7 feet deep. So the excitement spread through the camp and gave them renewed energy. And 2 days later, 2 more gold ingots were discovered. So a few days later, Dolores Cancino, he rode into camp and he discovered that a total of 12 ingots had been uncovered so far. At this point, the 2 men, they rode into Santa Fe to sell the gold and split the profits so far. Upholt told Cancino that he needed to check on some of his mining claims and interest in things he had going on back home in Colorado, and that he would come back as soon as he could to continue their operation. So after many months had passed, Cancino believed Upholt was actually not coming back, so he thought he better continue the operation for himself because he had not heard from Upholt. So he rode back out to the Arroyo and he discovered that more flash floods had filled in their excavations and the channel had changed again. So the modified channel made it hard to tell where they had been excavating before. And soon Cancino gave up and he eventually sold his ranch after he had no luck for quite a while looking again. So he moved to Santa Fe. He purchased a small grocery store and he would live in Santa Fe and work at the grocery store, and he would die about 13 years later. He never returned again to look for the gold, and it's likely that there are still gold ingots buried in Cancino Arroyo somewhere, and if they were worth $2,000 around 1880, they would likely be worth a heck of a lot of money today, and there was likely quite a few of them. I don't know how many pounds the ingots were, but if they loaded their pack mules down with as many as they could carry, and if only a dozen of them were found, there's likely to be many more in the Arroyo somewhere, but they could have sunk pretty deep by now too. So that is the story of the lost gold ingots of Cancino Arroyo in northern New Mexico.